All right, thank you, Catherine. One thing Catherine didn't mention is I'm a dean, but I'm also a PhD student at Simmons College. So what you're about to receive is you're going to be subjected to a part of my research. So bar the doors, lock it down. You're going to have to put up with me. This is PhD research. So I'll dive in. This is based on an article that I published. I have the citation in the PowerPoint here, so you'll get that if you get the presentation. I would encourage you to read it. It's an article with the same title, Future Role of Publishing Services in University Libraries. It was published in Portal, Libraries in the Academy in October 2012. So with that, I'll begin. University libraries, I've noted that they are both these, we're both witness to the changes that we watch publishers, et cetera, go through, users of scholarship, as well as we're actors. We do control our own destiny. There are things we can do to shape how we want to go forward. I really wanted to spend time looking at where all of this is going. You're going to hear a little bit more after I talk specifically about the Library Publishing Coalition, and I think my study really shows the need for such a coalition, and that's kind of where I'm going to end up. But I wanted to talk with people who are very involved in library publishing services, or as we now affectionately call LPS. We have to have an acronym, right? LPS is the acronym. So I interviewed a group of people involved in this, largely university library publishing service managers, a few library directors who are very involved in publishing services, and some of what I describe as kind of the thought leaders amongst us. Not all of us work in libraries. There are some of those who are consultants in the field or work for groups like Spark or ARL and the like. So I did a formal study to really look at these futures. So scenario planning as a research method really looks at 15 years from now. There's research out there that shows that there's some reasonable possibility of being able to project where things might be in 15 years. After that, the reasonableness just kind of goes down the pike there. So we made this attempt to kind of look at this. So I wrote scenarios in this sense and focused on forces around kind of the economic, political, cultural, and technological forces that we're all experiencing. Again, I think a lot of the publishing activities out there within libraries they're kind of one-off. They're certainly siloed, but from library to library, there's not a lot of collaboration or larger level activities. That's not to say there's none, because there are some, but it's certainly in the minority. So during this study, what I did was to get these 20 people to kind of react and respond to these scenarios that I wrote, and it's really through that response that what you're really doing is eliciting their thoughts and opinions on where this is all going to go, what are the drivers, what's working well, what's not working well, and then I basically look for trends. I'm looking for kind of outlying opinions as well as kind of convergence of opinions. What are the trends that are coming up through this? And again, there's the article citation for you. So the major forces that I looked at with this were, of course, economics, money, right? Resources. You gotta look at this. So I specifically wanted to look at the impact of research funding for research institutions. I mean, that's the context in which university libraries work, right? We've got to look at what is kind of our university base of funding. Where is it trending? What are the sources of revenue, and how do the libraries tap into that, or not? And what do we do there? And how is that going to affect our publishing services? Again, in this kind of a formal research methodology, we look at what's the most uncertain force. So if the key force is the economical context, what's the most uncertain force? Spent a lot of time on this, read a lot of literature, kind of pre-tested some of this with my participants, and came up with it's really this cultural aspect of faculty perception of publishing. And I'll dwell on this a little bit more as I move along. But largely the question is, will faculty and universities adopt library publishing services? Will they see them as legitimate and part of a growing norm? Do they fit in consistently kind of with the philosophy and outlook of the disciplines that particular faculty are involved in, or not? So it's really, when we look at the scenarios, it's really how these two things come together, and it's your typical axes here. And the four scenarios that I wrote dealt with this, whether you have kind of rising funding for research institutions, excuse me, or declining funding for research institutions. And then kind of the horizontal, it's if faculty are satisfied with their current publishing outlets or not satisfied. If the idea being is if they're not satisfied, they may be apt to look for some other publishing services and publishing outlets. Library-based publishing could be one of those. So, excuse me. So again, I would just encourage you, I'm not going to take a lot of time to tell you about the scenarios themselves. Read the article if you want to. I kind of want to get to the findings because that's what's really the interesting part, how people responded to these. But real quickly, one is this idea of libraries as robust and competitive publishers, that we publish pretty much, that's kind of the nirvana. We publish pretty much anything and everything we want to do. Why? Because we have lots of funding and we have faculty very much interested in working with us. So we do niche publishing. We might compete directly with more well-founded commercial publishers and the like. So the second scenario really is dealing with kind of the specialized publishers. This is, again, where there's funding, but faculty they don't necessarily embrace the library as publisher, and we get ourselves more involved in niche markets. And the people I interviewed talked about, so what's a niche market? And I think the attitude that started to arise was areas where commercial publishers just can't operate very well anymore, where they may not be profitable enough or just not enough readership. Some aspect of it makes it difficult for the commercial scholarly publisher or a society-based publisher to go. The third one was really more about libraries as cooperative publishers. I feel like this tends towards a little bit more of the realistic viewpoint of things, where we have faculty who are interested in working with us, but we face a future of stable to declining resources, and how are we going to do this? And the quick answer to that is, a lot of people said, well, we collaborate. We're going to have to work together. No one institution can do it all by itself. And then the fourth is kind of, that's the scenario I always call the null set. We don't do a whole lot. So the polite way of saying that is that libraries as curators and consultants in publishing. So we kind of curate the output. We might help consult on some rights issues. So we're kind of consultants off to the side, or we're the quiet receiver of the scholarship at the end. So with that, I'll kind of launch into the findings. And again, keep in mind the findings are what people said in this regard. And I recorded all this. And again, I will apologize. I have a few slides that are very, very wordy. That's because they said a lot. So again, the commercial is read the article. But I'll go through some of this. So there's about 8 or 9 of these areas that really began to coalesce as I interviewed people, again, reacting to these scenarios. But the first one, I was a little bit amazed at this at first, but the first one, when I asked people about library publishing services and why you're getting involved in this area, people came back to me and just said, well, we made a conscious decision we wanted to do this. So it's interesting to me that, I thought I'd kind of get this, well, we fell into it, a faculty member asked us to run a journal and we did that. And in 2011 to 2012, when I did this, I kind of got the opposite. So, as a researcher, you have to watch for your preconceptions and what you think the answers are going to be. Because a lot of the folks I talked to, that's what they said. We made a conscious decision to take on this role as digital publisher. At the same time, they speculated that, they're not too sure that a lot of university libraries are going to be doing this. And I said, I would follow up with it, well, why? Why do you think there's, this is a niche and not a lot are going to do this in a real pervasive and robust way? 2 things. We saw, financial aspects lacking, skilled staff are lacking, and every person I talked to talked about the resistance of traditional librarians in the library. So yeah, the message here is, who's keeping libraries from evolving at times? We are. We can be our own worst enemy. Everybody I interviewed talked about this as their largest challenge, and some of them talked about how it actually changed their strategic and implementation plans based on that level of resistance within their library. At the same time, these were libraries who were telling me this who publish 75 to 100 journals, very robust publishers in their fields, and still talk about the resistance. So it's interesting to kind of get that characterization when you see some of these libraries so thoroughly involved in this area. They did talk a lot about transitioning staff into these kind of new program areas, a lot of training, a lot of exposure to the work, and looking for reallocation of dollars to do this. So how do you do this? And not one of them said that their university libraries or a library they knew of received funds from their administration to take this on. So it would appear that 100% of what's going on in university libraries around publishing services is we've carved this out of our own monies to do this. So that's kind of the dynamic here. We have constrained resources, some at least measurable amount of kind of librarian resistance, enough that it's a topic to deal with, which gives some rise to the debate about, is this going to become kind of a core service base of university and research libraries or not? Again, although many of them are doing it, and I think the LPC, which you'll hear more about soon, is a good indicator of it, with about 50 university and college libraries involved. So there are many there that are doing this. So choosing the library as publisher and faculty's level of happiness with existing publishing. This was the one that I think I had to work on the most, as I kind of teased out comments from people, and I think there was this conclusion. I think a lot of them didn't realize this is what they were saying at first, but several of the people I worked with on this basically we had come around to this, that the real driver is not necessarily what libraries are going to do or what publishers are going to do, it's the creators of the scholarship. What do they want to do with their works? I mean, I found Britt's talk yesterday very interesting about what he wanted to do with his article, before and after publication, and I think that's just it. When you get certain faculty members who decide what it is they want to do, they want to do it. They're very committed to handling their scholarship in the way that they decide to do so. So we felt like this was very much this most uncertain factor, how faculty will feel about library publishing services, but that's the question I started with. The question kind of we ended up with is, how satisfied are faculty with existing publishing outlets and services? And that's going to kind of determine things. The aspects that we heard a lot about is, so where might satisfaction or dissatisfaction be in the process? So we heard about quality of peer review. That's still a strong item, and I think we know that some of the best OA journals out there have a strong peer review system. Speediness in publishing their work. They want to get it out. They want impact. They want citations, et cetera. All those measurable items that they can show to their tenure review committees, et cetera. Difficulty in gaining access after publication. I mean, we heard this from Britt yesterday. That seems to be a very big item for people. Levels of restriction on reuse of scholarly work. Heard this quite a bit from the publishing services people, that they've heard this from their faculties. And we have all seen license agreements where you can't necessarily use material in your course, or you can't use it in a distance ed course that you teach, et cetera. So I think that's trending in a little bit better direction with some publishers, but that's still an issue on the minds of, of faculty. They reuse their own work in a lot of different ways. And many of them agreed that this is something that we've not really looked at as a library information science field. We've not really taken the time yet to study faculty's level of satisfaction with current publishing services. Needed more work on this. So the next area was this notion that faculty are not a monolithic group, but multiple divergent discipline-centric groups. So I know when I first wrote up the first draft of scenarios, there was a lot of this, the faculty this, the faculty that, and I didn't necessarily mean it to be monolithic, but everybody picked up on that and talked about how their experiences are much more discipline-centric. They recognize that their publishing services might need to be altered a little bit. I think most of us here, know this, probably have experienced this if you're involved in these services. But again, how to do that with it, as few resources as we have around these things, how much adjustment or even customization can we make, with our services? This is where resources come in to be able to do this. But again, this was a topic that came up quite a bit. So this was one I did not necessarily expect, although I felt like if I was interviewed for this, I would have brought up opportunism, but I didn't think about it as a researcher. But many people talked about this. The library directors and certainly the publishing services managers talked about this. So again, back to the question of, why are certain libraries engaging in LPS? Why are you doing this? And the answer I got from several of them was just, I've been opportunistic. I've been able to gain resources for this one way or another. A couple of them had told me stories about how they actually picked up like a digital knowledge think tank group thing on their campus that had 4 or 5 people, and they changed it into a publishing unit, things like that. So again, I think I have to tip our hats to our colleagues out there. I think we have some really smart, bright people out there who are thinking about where they want their libraries to be and how to add those resources, and they know they're not just going to get them because they put it in a budget request to the provost every year. They're looking for units or even people on their campuses that they think they can fold in and then kind of cajole or morph into something more that the library sees that needs to be done. So I was very impressed with some of that talk. Again, and then reallocating resources was talked about a great deal. But I like the opportunism. That was it's a very positive outlook. Instead of talking about the lack of resources and the lack of skills, et cetera, which definitely came out in this study, it was this, but I can grow this. I find opportunistic ways to reach out to others on campus or actually move them into the library and work. And we're not necessarily talking about university presses here, all sorts of different groups out there. A lot of in terms of opportunities too, a lot of the university libraries I talked with had talked about how there's these niche markets. I kind of just mentioned this at the very beginning about certain areas where commercial publishing may no longer be profitable, and they feel that they're in a position to serve some of these fields, especially if certain fields are of high importance to a given university. That library feels like that's the group that they need to go work with. And they all talked about how this is not about generating profits. It's not it's really about controlling costs. There are definitely costs doing this, but everybody realized they wanted to control costs for the end user, and as opposed to generating cost recovery funds to do this. So that's a different model than we see with a lot of university presses. We heard those remarks yesterday about how a lot of university presses still to date are expected to run on this cost recovery basis for most, if not all, of their funds that are needed. The university libraries are looking at controlling costs to be able to provide content openly. Next, there was talk about library publishing cooperatives, and it really came up in that third scenario, which is really now the title of that scenario, is kind of libraries as cooperative publishers. And this is, again, where I think it kind of relates to our history. Libraries cooperate on a lot of areas and issues and services over the years, and this may be the next great area that we do that. And one of the reasons why is we don't have enough resources to go it alone. Although that's what we're kind of doing right now. And you will find a lot of libraries out there that publish 1, 2, 10, 20 journals, for instance. Some of us work on conference proceedings. We're working on that at Virginia Tech. So they pointed a lot of my participants pointed to interinstitutional arrangements. The interesting part to me was nobody could really put any detail or meat on the bones with that. They just pointed to that as this is an area where we think we can have some economy of scale, build out services, and look to each other for some help. And so I kept trying to tease out, so give me more. What are we talking about here? So we did get some comments about, well, shared technology. But again, that was kind of it, a one line about, well, we can share technology. We don't have to develop it by ourselves. We don't have to host it by ourselves. Maybe one university supports all the technology for a group of 10 universities that publish together, and again, libraries that are publishing together, something like that. Sharing of talent, I think this is a huge area where we all can't hire all the people that we need to do this well. And again, my participants talked a lot about ranging from software application developers to network administrators, creative professionals, marketing and graphics, business and finance professionals, contract administrators, et cetera. So quite a range, to do this well and do it right. And talked about how that could be done in a cooperative manner with any given library having responsibility for maintaining staff in a certain area. Maybe you've already worked on the marketing and graphics section, and you can offer some good creative talent to a small group of other university libraries, while that other library might have software developers, et cetera. So I tried to probe more on, did they see this as a kind of a centralized approach versus distributed? Centralized being, that there's somebody at the center who provides a lot of this stuff that needs to go on with publishing. And everybody kind of shook their head. Don't know, I don't know. I haven't really seen a really great model out there. It could be either or. So I think collectively we felt like that library cooperative publishing holds a lot of promise, and further research is needed. And I think it's kind of interesting that we have to say that here in 2013 when we had Raim Crow publishing a report on library publishing cooperatives. That's the title of it, in 2006. And Raim's not here, but if he were here, he would probably talk about that. I've had conversations with him about it. So we see where this holds promise. We also know that true collaboration is not the low-hanging fruit of any field. It is high-hanging fruit in any field. This is hard to do. Doesn't mean it can't be done. There's a lot of real good collaborations that's going on within library and information science. I think we all know this. So it's very achievable, but it's a multi-year process, and it takes commitment, and it takes a lot of trust building and allocation of resources. Anyway, I think this slide is the one that says this is why the Library Publishing Coalition has come about, in my opinion, because of this kind of response and thinking that's going on in the field. A lot of interest in this, but still a lot of vagueness as to how we pull this off. So, of course, technology was talked about quite a bit. And again, kind of in that cooperative interinstitutional context, it was really brought up. Saw a need to kind of develop an organization that handles all of this for us, or have it distribute. It could be a distributed organization, but that there was a lot around developing and deploying and managing a shared technology base. So again, found that interesting that as soon as we talked about technology, a lot of it was, you know, we need to do this in an interinstitutional way, and we need to recognize that publishing technology is not library technology. This is different in that we don't necessarily have a lot of expertise in those kinds of technologies. Some of us are hiring people out of the publishing industry who can help us with that. So a lot going on there. Within technology, one of the things mentioned frequently as well was this challenge of incorporating free web publishing tools. You know, you have WordPress, et cetera, a lot of the open tools out there on the web that people are using, and how do we incorporate that into our services? Or you see some very enterprising faculty who create journals, for instance, or have, you know, maybe it's monographs or other kinds of multimedia, and they use those kinds of tools. But they start to approach the library looking for more structure, more support, more resources, yet they want to use those tools. So people saw that as an area that needs to be addressed. How do we incorporate those tools? So more context. Several people had mentioned this kind of international shift in the publishing industry and research dynamics. I found it interesting that two of them very much harped on with me about they felt very certain that there's this large research capacity shift towards China, and that's going to eventually have an impact on publishing. So I think it depends on who you read and who you talk to there. You know, the country of China has built up a lot of infrastructure, but there's also a lot of research facilities that lie vacant, that aren't being used at this point. So there's speculation there that perhaps they're going to be, you know, hiring people from around the world and bring them into those kinds of facilities. You know, time will tell. But I think the point is people, beyond research and even dealing with publishing, people are kind of looking at, you know, where does China fit into this, and other areas as well. But definitely China was the place that was talked about the most. Next, and this is one I was very intrigued by, was this notion of traditional publishing versus new forms of scholarly communication. This came up quite a bit. I think the more enterprising people I talked to, they realized that, you know, as you've heard me already, I kind of talked about journals. I've mentioned books only once. I mentioned conference proceedings, but there's all these other kinds of publishing activities that are going on that libraries seem to be developing a really good niche around. Kind of the bottom bullet I think of is kind of some really good digital humanities type projects or digital resource development. Catherine Skinner yesterday mentioned two of my favorite projects, the Slave Voyages project and Southern Spaces at Emory. You know, excellent examples. Oh, and I see a typo in digital resources. Okay, well, I changed that the other day. So, web-based virtual communities, journal content. Southern Spaces is a good example of that. You know, preprint digital repositories, blog-based publishing, data publishing on the web, and the like. So I think people see that there's a, you know, with the web itself and the nature of digital resources, there's a lot of different ways to create scholarly content, research content, and put it out there. And that maybe this is where we have the most opportunity, is to work on those new forms. And why? Because we're not as invested in other modes of production and types of carriers of scholarly content as, you know, as other people are. So the new media realm seems to be less competition with established publishers, and an area where libraries can grow. I mean, I would also say, although this didn't come up a lot in the interviewing, but I asked them about it, and the participants, I didn't get a lot of responses to it, but I said instead of just libraries coming in and doing this because there's less competition, what about partnering with societies and or commercial scholarly publishers and working more in this area? And I just didn't get a lot of response to that. So interesting. I do think the mindset right now is for libraries to think about how do they develop their niche. So there's also what came up a lot was this assumption that LPS would cost less than commercial publishing, and I was really kind of thankful that this came up because it allowed me to get to this topic that I think a lot of us do presume that somehow we're going to be able to do this cheap or cheaper than some others. But several people had mentioned that they really felt like for libraries to do LPS well, it was going to take years to be able to do this, and noted that, you know, there are businesses out there, society and commercial publishers who've been at this a long time, and they have really honed their production models. They do this in a very, for them, a cost-efficient way, I would say. That was definitely some of the prevailing thinking from, you know, 3 or 4 of these folks who talked an awful lot about that. And because of that, felt that, you know, libraries were not looking necessarily to this work to displace commercial publishers, but instead be mission-driven and key in on fields that are of great importance to our universities and to provide publishing services in those kinds of areas. So these are my concluding thoughts and all that. There are some basic takeaways. This idea of kind of niche publishing. You know, that libraries are, you know, in early days with some of this. There's an assumption that some publishing areas will be or become unprofitable that we should be looking at. There are certain fields that are very important to our individual universities that we should be looking at. And that there's these opportunities around new media publishing forms. And I think we have been seeing that for some years. I think the issue there is how do we take that from being the one-off project to dealing with new media, new forms of digital scholarship in a much more robust platform-based way. So it's a large and regular production workflow. This perceived power of library publishing cooperatives was huge, that there needs to be this development of business and service models, sharing of talent, sharing of technology, et cetera. So again, I think a lot there, and again, I think that's where the, you know, the LPC comes in. And this decision to engage LPS equals opportunism. I was just really struck by the positive outlook on this, that the people who are engaged in this see this as a large and important growing role for their libraries. And that they needed to, you know, align this with local visions and decisions that are going on in their local academy. And then this guiding issue about, you know, partnering with faculty, and that they're not going to do it if they're not motivated to do so. So this notion of satisfaction versus dissatisfaction really does seem to be quite the guiding issue for us as we go forward. And I think that helps us to know as we reach out to our faculties and talk with them about projects and publishing. You know, we want to kind of get at that. We want to ask them about their current activities and what do they feel good about, what are they not so happy with. So that's it. Thank you for your time, and I'll take questions later. Thank you.